What do the Alexamenos Graffito, the Pilate Stone, and the Yehohanan Heelbone have in common? Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the Bible, its lands, civilizations, and archaeology. What these three things have in common is that inevitably you will see them included in lists that typically come out around Easter, claiming to provide archaeological evidence for the death and crucifixion of Jesus. However, what these lists typically do not do is get into the conversation of what scholars and archaeologists say these finds can actually tell us. So that is where we're going to spend our time this week. We are going to take a deep dive into each of these artifacts to discuss what it is, what scholars say it can tell us, and then also discuss how these objects get overused to support claims that they simply cannot back up. Remember, for access to ad-free versions of our video podcast and exclusive bonus content, join us on Patreon at Bible and Arc. So settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about the Alexamenos Graffito, the Pilate Stone, and the Yehohanan Heelbone. Okay, Mary Kate, we have a short list of some commonly searched things Easter time related. We are very much aware of the calendar, the time of year that we're in. It's April. Easter is coming up here in a few short weeks, and inevitably, there's some names, some artifacts that get circulated every Easter as proof of either the crucifixion or evidence for Jesus, archaeological or textual. And so we want to take a moment today to go through some of those.
Yeah, just four-ish.
Four-ish, I think, is a good way to put it. Four-ish. Some of these, I think, maybe are exactly the ones people are expecting. Some of these are maybe things you have not heard of before. But these are the four. We wanted to limit ourselves because the internet is an endless cave of possibilities.
Yes.
For things people might claim are proof or evidence one way or another. So we are focusing on things that have something. Whether they go all the way to prove Jesus or not is a different question. But that there is something within each of these that is some sort of contextual, historical value there. So these are not down the rabbit hole of maybe, let's say, full conspiratorial planning. We're not going down the things that are unprovenanced and this came from someone's basement. We're not going that path.
Yes.
All of these are things that have debates on their connection with Jesus, and we can kind of put our cards on the table up front and say they don't prove what you might see them being claimed to prove in some corners of the internet.
Yes, but that doesn't mean they don't offer us anything.
That's the distinction.
And that's what we want to talk about today.
That's what we want to talk about. That's why we picked the list that we have. So our short list is the Alexamenos Graffito, the Pilate Stone, the Yehohanan Heelbone, and then we will briefly touch on Josephus. Not an archaeological artifact, but a textual thing that commonly comes up. So that's the short list that we're going to go through. And let's just make our way through.
Yeah.
Maybe one that is the least known out of these, Alexamenos.
I would say that's probably the least known from the list.
The Alexamenos Graffito. So
what is the Alexamenos Graffito?
So what is the Alexamenos Graffito is the perfect question to start with. And why graffito? So it's a singular graffito rather than graffiti, this small inscription. So it was carved on a building on the Palatine Hill that archaeologists think was probably connected to the training of imperial scribes. Mm-hmm. Not totally sure, but they're like, well, based on what's around here, we think that this is what this is. The dating of this is similarly, confusing, maybe, as with everything in archaeology, there's a range. And so the common range is 3rd to 5th century CE. Sometimes you will see things that say maybe it's late 2nd, or, how blurry is the line between late 2nd and early 3rd. Sometimes that can be a small distinction. But 3rd century to 5th century is when people most normally say this is kind of the comfortable range. But what is it? Okay, so it's an inscription in the plaster that was on the wall of a building. It depicts two individuals. One of them we believe is this individual, Alexamenos. One of them is a donkey-headed figure who's being crucified. And then it has a line of text that says Alexamenos worships his God. And so that's what we have there. It's small. It doesn't have a ton of detail. It's a very captivating image. If you've never seen it before, I'd say look it up. You see this and you think like, this looks like album art. Like it looks like the cover of something.
Yeah.
But that's all in and of itself. When you just look at it, that's what it is.
Yeah, it's very much kind of crudely etched.
Yeah.
Graffiti.
It gets attributed to as an imperial scribal training facility. Most people think, okay, this was made by someone young, potentially, who is training in this process. So is this a skilled artisan? Probably not. This is someone who was doing some work. And this is also just one of 2 inscriptions related to Alexamenos that come from this building. There's another one that just mentions him and says Alexamenos is faithful.
Yeah.
So we have 2 of these attached to this individual. People don't think that Alexamenos is the one making them. Maybe the second one, some people argue. The one where it's Alexamenos is faithful, some people say maybe that is Alexamenos making this.
Like a comeback kind of thing?
To defend themselves. The first one, however, is mocking in tone. It gets called a hostile witness. It's a hostile inscription. And if you're listening to this, the question naturally is,
what does it have to do with Jesus?
What does any of this have to do with Jesus? We have the name Alexamenos. We don't have the name Jesus. We don't have a scene that we might associate with kind of the reverence with which the scene of the crucifixion normally gets talked about or depicted. We do have a cross, but outside of that, that's about all that we get. And so naturally the question is, how does this connect to Jesus?
Well, this is thought to be the earliest representation of the crucified Jesus, right?
If you accept some things.
If you accept some things.
Yeah, so
but that's like a commonly held belief, would you say?
This gets pointed to as the earliest depiction of the crucifixion of Jesus, depending on some historical interpretation that comes to us from texts. In and of itself, you could look at this and say, just on what I'm seeing, I don't see how this is connected to Jesus. And you would be fair in thinking that.
Yeah.
If you are removed from the cultural claims that are floating around in ancient Rome regarding some ideas about Christians, those are the things that then become the key to interpret this. As with everything, if we're missing the backstory, you can lose completely the meaning of something. I think it's like if you were to show a meme to your grandparents and they don't know this is a random photo. I have no idea what you were talking about here. But you show that to someone who knows and maybe knows like 5 layers deep of the history and development, it can say a lot. And so the Alexamenos Graffito is doing something similar. We do this in art all the time. You're pulling on an image to convey something without having to write it down. And that's what we have happening in this. And there's a couple other details within this that help support some of the social construct that's being unpacked in the Alexamenos Graffito.
So should we talk about the social construct? Why, if this is the earliest depiction of Jesus, why he would be a donkey?
Why is Jesus a donkey? Because the donkey head is what people point to as the key to understanding this is Jesus. Not the fact that this individual is on a cross. Not the fact that both of the individuals are depicted wearing clobia, which are these lower class tunics. They get associated with enslaved individuals, servile individuals, low-class individuals in ancient Rome. Something that is not the thing you want to be depicted as wearing. And the thing, if you're looking at the picture, the reason why the crucified man's behind is hanging out is because this is a short tunic. And so a little bit more of the mockery that's happening there. That's not like okay, that must be Jesus. It does say something about the social class of the worshiper and the person being crucified that might line up with some of what we have with the early church as being associated with low-class individuals in early development in Rome. The cross, okay, that connects to an idea of Jesus' crucifixion, but Jesus is far from the only individual that gets crucified in the Roman Empire. And so then it's the donkey head.
Yeah.
And the donkey head is the moment where you do need the backstory of what are the arguments that are being made against Christians that don't just start with Christians either. So this is the claim that Christians worshipped either a donkey or a god with the head of a donkey. And this is something that we see refuted in Christian writers like Tertullian and Origen, who say, no, right? You all say that we worship this donkey-headed god or this donkey god. And their line of attack is normally, well, if that was true, why wouldn't you want to worship it too? Because you worship all these gods that have animal heads.
Yeah.
So you say that to us as an insult. But by saying that, like, this god then
redundant.
This god then looks like your god. So what's the big deal? So they try to turn that back. But they are pointing to the fact that there is a widely circulated claim. It's called anultry, that they're worshiping some kind of donkey individual. Why? That is hazier. It develops off of a claim that had been made against Jews, which we see in Josephus. He refutes the same thing and against Apion. That you say we either have a figure of a donkey in the temple or that we worship a god that's connected to a donkey, and that that's not true.
Well, a donkey in itself is kind of an insult.
A donkey can be seen as an insult, and this is one where, yeah, is that in and of itself the most insulting part? Maybe it is. How much of that is like, do they find the donkey as insulting as we might?
Yeah.
Is it always this insulting term or animal to be connected to? We do get that in art from that period, in plays, that it is still continued to be used as an insult. So maybe just on its face, it can be that. But it also becomes the thing that, okay, if we know that Christians are being accused in ancient Rome of worshiping a god that is connected to a donkey, and then we have a donkey-headed figure being crucified, and that early Christians are saying they worship a god who they say was crucified. And the Romans are saying, okay, that's how we get that detail plus this detail. They're not saying it's Jesus. It doesn't say Alexamenos worships his god, Jesus. We don't get that. But it's based on those pieces of cultural context that come together to say, maybe this is, and why scholars say this probably is the earliest depiction of the crucifixion of Jesus that we have. And it's a hostile one. It doesn't come from the early church. It's mocking them.
I mean, but it does prove, or support rather than prove, the idea that Christians were worshiping in early Rome at this time.
Yeah, so what is it?
What we can take from it.
What does it do for us?
Yeah.
I think is a great question of, does this prove that Jesus was crucified? No, it can't do that. It supports the idea that there are individuals who worshiped a figure they believed to have been crucified.
Yes.
That they identify as God. Is that just Alexamenos, or is he representative of a community? He's representative of a community here that believes in a God that they say was crucified. This is not a picture of Jesus on the cross taken with a timestamp and here's evidence that can be submitted. That's not what this is.
Yeah.
This can just tell us there are people that had this faith position.
Yeah.
That's not then proof that Jesus was crucified, because the way this will get used sometimes under the guise of as a hostile witness, which it is, it's a hostile witness to these claims. But it can be overused to say, okay, see, this proves that Jesus was crucified. This proves that. It can't do that.
Yeah, it can't prove anything.
It can't prove that that happened. It can just tell us there are individuals who had this position of belief, which is not nothing.
Yeah.
That's
not at all. We can take a lot from that. We can learn a lot about a cultural context from this graffito.
It can tell us a lot of things. Also, one of the reasons why this piece matters, coming from the 3rd to the 5th century, is depictions of the crucifixion of Jesus don't really start to pick up until the 6th century.
Yeah.
They are not the things that early Christians are depicting in art. Triumphal Jesus is more popular. The image of the Lamb is more popular. But the crucifixion is a moment that becomes really important and is a thing we're super familiar with seeing all the time.
Yeah.
But when it connects you to an individual that is killed by the state, that may be a part of this rebellion, it has some connotations that aren't the most loved. And it's not until some heresies pick up in the 5th and 6th century that start to say, maybe Jesus wasn't human. Starting off with Docetism, moving this way and continuing down that path in the 6th century, then the moment of the crucifixion becomes more important, not just as a moment of death, but to prove that Jesus was not just divine, but also human. Because if Jesus was only divine, then Jesus cannot die. And so that crucifixion moment is a proof of the humanity. And so you get the increase of this. But for early Christian history, there's this gap where you don't have the moment everybody thinks now might be the thing you expect to see everywhere. You don't. You don't get it outside of something like this.
Yeah.
But not the version that you might expect to have coming up early. Like if you were to ask someone, if it's Jeopardy style, and pick which one of these is the earliest depiction of Jesus, and one of the options is a donkey-headed individual on a cross, is that the picture of Jesus? You're going to say that's the earliest depiction of Jesus being crucified. It's the earliest scholars think. Probably not the one people are going to pick. But right now, it's the one scholars point to.
Yeah.
Which is surprising. But interesting. I think it's a very fun image. I mean, not fun as in like depicting this scene from an outside perspective that relies on all of this cultural context for an academic reading of it. adds in so many more things that it opens up fun conversations of, okay, well, how do we come to these readings that requires you to walk down these paths of how do pieces come together to say something? How much can it say? That opens different avenues than if it's the cleanest thing.
I also think I like the graffito because it is such a common piece of work.
Yeah.
It was just made by someone. And it's not a huge depiction of art, or
it's not a giant mural in a church.
It's not a super refined inscription. It's essentially an etching.
Yeah.
And we still have it.
That someone made in mockery, most likely, right? That you are teasing, you are harassing. If you are competing with other potential scribes, that this might be the thing. And you will see sometimes in like the apologetic conversations of this, really leaning into trying to humanize the person that made this, and then Alexamenos. That's fine, but that can overreach sometimes in pulling on the emotion of like, oh, and look at how faithful this individual is, and that's why they make this other one that is Alexamenos is faithful. Is that him? Did Alexamenos write that one in response to this one? Maybe. You can't prove it though, because it could have also just been continuing the mockery of the first one to say, the inscription around the corner that says you worship that donkey-headed figure? Well, I'm going to put over here, Alexamenos is faithful, and everyone puts one and one and goes,
to the donkey-headed
to the donkey. So is that a defense of yourself, or is that just continuing the insult? It could go either way. We're limited in how much you can say that this means, but that's why 1 + 1 + 1 here ends up equaling this is claimed to be the earliest depiction of Jesus being crucified. Proof of the crucifixion? No. But an early depiction of the fact that people believed that Jesus had been crucified. Hey, Jordan here. I want to take a moment to invite you to our first live event. That's right, we're doing our first in-person live event, Digging into Easter. Come to the James Theater here in Iowa City on April 16th for a talk with Dr. Bob Cargill about not just the biblical Easter story you know, but the history and archaeology that lies behind the tradition. With Easter coming up, we think there's no better time to gain some insight into why this relationship matters. There will be a meet and greet before the talk and a live Q&A with Bob and I after. Tickets are available now through the link down in the description. So mark your calendars for April 16th and come join us at the James Theater here in Iowa City. We're looking forward to seeing you there. But now, let's get back to the podcast.
So should we pivot to our next piece?
We can pivot to our next piece because I think Alexamenos is very fascinating and it's a fun one to talk through. And if it's your first time coming to it, might be a bit of a surprise, but it's a fun one to move through. The next one, Pilate Stone.
Yes. I feel like this...
It's a name people know.
Most definitely. I think this is probably, I would say, the most famous piece that gets connected to archaeological Easter.
Yeah. Probably this and one that we're not going to go down the path with, the James ossuary, are probably two of them. But if we're grounding ourselves within things that have a context and that history behind them.
And maybe a little more legitimacy.
And some legitimacy because the James ossuary has some significant issues there. The Pilate Stone goes down a different path that does not pick up all of that problematic baggage, which is why we're going Pilate Stone.
Pilate Stone.
So what is it?
It's a piece of limestone that was found at Caesarea Maritima.
Mm-hmm.
And it has, I think it's issued by Pontius Pilate to Augustus, I believe.
Yeah. And we think so.
Yeah, because it's
highly fragmentary.
It's very fragmented, but it names Pontius Pilate as the person who most likely issued this stone, and it names him as a prefect of Judea.
Proof, right? It's done. We've got it. We've got the name of Pilate. Well, we have the name of Pilate in the Bible being connected to the crucifixion of Jesus. Case closed.
So yes, it supports the existence of a Pontius Pilate, who is said to have been the one to sentence Jesus to death in the gospel narratives. But it doesn't have anything to do with Jesus himself.
This has nothing to reference Jesus. This doesn't talk about the crucifixion. This talks about none of the context around that.
But it does place in existence a character named Pilate, who played a very important role in the gospel narratives.
In the gospel narrative, if the gospel narratives are to be believed on the sequence of events,
yes,
Pilate plays a significant role.
A very significant role. I also will note it names him as a prefect rather than a procreator, which is debated within further narratives.
Yeah, and what role does he have? And not all scholars agree whether the two terms should be understood as fully distinct from each other. Are they overlapping? Could you hold both? Or how worried were the Romans about making sure all the right titles showed up in all the places? This is something that Bart Ehrman has talked about as well. And so that's something that could be at odds with the gospel narratives. This is coming from a different time period. There's different debates that happen there. Not the thing that then proves or disproves this being connected with Jesus. Because, as we said, with what it says, it tells us something about Pilate, who before this we were missing information for. We had him in the Gospels, and then where are you at?
Yeah.
The Pilate Stone comes in to give us something here because he has this 10-year service as the prefect, as whatever he ends up being, what name you want to go with there, in the Roman province of Judea, and plays a big role in the Gospels. So how do we have nothing for him? This fills some of that hole.
It does.
But even there, I think it is surprising for individuals to say, well, this is then the proof. This is all that we have. And you're like, this is the big thing. This stone that's dedicating something, some type of construction. Is it a statue? Is it some kind of public building? We don't know, because this stone was found in reuse.
Yeah, at Caesarea Maritima.
As a part of a staircase. So it's not found in the original context connected to whatever Pilate was dedicating. It has been taken off of that. It has been reused as building material, which isn't uncommon, but as building material within a staircase. Because Pilate doesn't have the best reputation. Maybe they're not so worried about preserving everything that Pilate built. And so this gets found in reuse in the stairs for a Herodian theater. Again, telling us maybe they don't really care about Pilate, not so worried about securing this connection between Pilate and a moment of crucifixion. The stone certainly doesn't tell us anything about Pilate and the moment of the crucifixion. It can't tell us that he was there. It can't tell us he did any of these things. It just says that there was an individual, named Pilate.
Yeah.
Case not closed, because that's all we have.
Case not closed. It provides sustenance to the narrative.
Yeah.
It provides legitimacy to characters, but it doesn't do anything for us in the narrative beyond that.
No, it does very little for us within the things that people want it to do. It cannot do most everything that individuals reaching to this as proof want it to do. It can't prove the crucifixion. It can't prove that Pilate says, and I'm going to wash my hands of this, and this is, it can't do any of that for us. Just saying that there is an individual named Pilate and that the stone supports that does not mean every narrative we have about that individual is true. We have lots of stories about Alexander the Great. And we have things that say, Alexander the Great was real. Does that mean every story about Alexander the Great that mentions him is true because we have this proof of Alexander? He's got coins. No, we are comfortable saying that doesn't line up with so many other individuals. But when we really need it because we don't have things, then sometimes people are comfortable putting some of that natural skepticism and distance that they require, or the evidence that they require to say, I'm comfortable accepting that as proof, can quickly be swept away in certain contexts with certain names for certain purposes. And something like the crucifixion, because of the important place that it comes to hold, is one of those moments where sometimes people are willing to put aside the evidentiary standards that they normally require.
Yeah.
So Pilate Stone, much like the Alexamenos, proof of Jesus' crucifixion? No. Proof of a context here of a historical individual? Yes. Not what you might want to be hearing from that. Not the way you might hear that talked about.
Probably what a lot of people think it says.
I think not what, if you're not going to actually read what it says, the assumption can be, oh, it's the Pilate Stone, and they know this and they just go another way without trying to find out what does it say.
And the name, I'm not saying it's a bad name at all. It's exactly what it is. It's a stone mentioning Pontius Pilate. But the Pilate Stone, I feel like, has such a connotation of like, this is such an important object, the Pilate Stone.
Yeah. And then you see it, and it does have words on it, but half of it is missing. And we have half words on the other side, which is why there are debates on exactly what does it say. Is this dedicating a building in the honor of Tiberius? Is this to divine Augustus? Like, what does it say? Doesn't always match if you're looking at different translations of this, because these are proposed readings based off of the parts of words that we have, what might be going into these other gaps. So there's not total agreement on that part. There's not total agreement on what it means. There's not agreement on what it might have been on before. That's a lot of place of speculation. So if you see definite answers that, oh, it was on this thing and it certainly said this, well, we don't know that.
Yeah, and we can't prove that.
You can't know it. You can't prove it. So that one needs to go, I think, to the side as well. Something that matters. It's important for the context of Pilate, yes, but not in the way that you might see it being leveraged, especially coming around to something like Easter, where that name Pilate is not a name you're going to hear very frequently in places like church, or not a part of the Bible that might get pointed to in a large part of the year. But you come around certain times and then that name Pilate might start to show up a lot more. So that's the Pilate Stone. It's something, but it's not the whole thing. It's not what everyone might want it to be. It might not be the version of that you would assume. I do think the point of what you assume it will be based off of the name is not misleading on the part. Like it's a stone and it says Pilate. But like, well, yeah, what would you title it otherwise of like brief reference to Pilate on a stone? You could do that. Sometimes objects in museums, get such vague names. It doesn't go too far. I think it leaves space though for people's imaginations to wander. So that's the Pilate.
I can agree with that.
That's the Pilate Stone.
The Yehohanan heel.
The Yehohanan heel bone. Yeah. So this is another one that, as we're moving down the path, like we're getting further and further away from like connection to the scene or the moment or depiction of the crucifixion of Jesus. Because with the Alexamenos, not from the moment of, but at least it's trying to depict a belief in that scene. Pilate Stone, not trying to do anything connected to that other than the name of an individual connected to that moment. And now with the heel bone, not even connected to Jesus, but a heel bone of an individual that is believed to have been crucified.
Yes. But this gets pointed to in every type of way.
Yeah, you see this one a lot.
You do. You see this so frequently.
And the fact that it is not, I think people don't assume that it's Jesus' heel bone.
I have definitely heard people who assumed it was Jesus' heel bone.
Because if it's Jesus' heel bone, then if that's the claim you're making,
then it doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense, because then you're probably arguing that from a position of faith, but then you run into other problems with Jesus' resurrection and ascension. And how is the heel bone still here? Which is a part of why the Holy Prepuce becomes such a big thing, because if Jesus was resurrected and ascended, bodily gone, except for that part that was left after the circumcision of Jesus. And so that's why we have those theories that come around. So if you're claiming that this is the heel bone, you're not. If individuals online are claiming this is the heel bone of Jesus, that's a problem, because you also will say that Jesus ascended bodily, or you have a problem with the humanity side. So not the heel bone of Jesus.
So this heel bone is the heel bone of a Judean man.
Yeah.
Who's named with an iron nail embedded in the heel bone, dating to sometime in the 1st century CE.
1st century, it's impossible to know exactly when, but before 70 CE is when most people will say, okay, because of then the fall here and what happens and the number of crucifixions and when, we're going to say before 70 CE is probably when this happens.
So this was found in a Jewish ossuary, and the man had further evidence of crucifixion.
Yeah.
So this is not what people may think it is, but it is our only evidence of Roman crucifixion, or
that's a debated one too.
Yes, okay.
Of is it or is it not? We have some finds from the UK as well that might be kind of similar discoveries of, is this the remains of individuals that have been crucified as well?
I know we have nails.
We got nails. A part of the problem with it is we know Romans are famous for crucifying people. If you ask individuals, what do you know about the Romans? It's probably going to be like, Julius Caesar and they crucified people might be at the top of the list.
They built stuff.
They built stuff. How often do you think about the Roman Empire? How often do you think about them crucifying people? It might go hand in hand. But we don't have a lot of evidence of them crucifying people. We also don't have that much description of how they actually crucified people. We have some, but we don't have like guidebooks of, and this is the how-to. This is how this goes through things. So little finds like this can become significant for people trying to understand how were individuals crucified. We have the later depictions of Jesus' crucifixion, which becomes the most famous version of this image. But is that reflecting a real tradition of how that happened or not? Are the feet stacked or are the feet to the side? Or those things become debates because we don't have a lot, which is where a bone like this, even outside of, more importantly, outside of, I would say, the alleged connections to the crucifixion of Jesus, which this does not have any, but just for the context of understanding Roman crucifixion, that's where this thing has something to say.
Yeah.
But as just one heel bone, one piece of evidence does not prove broader practice. Is this the way everyone was crucified, or is this the way one individual was crucified? So when we find this, it's in an ossuary. That ossuary has the bones of multiple individuals within it. And so there are signs of crucifixion on some other remains, but you do have to sort out whose bones go to who, and is this just one person, or there's multiple people in there. That ossuary is also itself something to keep in mind, because one frequent argument with this is, see, this is proof that you could take an individual who had been crucified and give them a burial.
Yes, which is, I think, what a lot of people point to within this.
And the reason that gets pointed to is, well, would they have been allowed to take Jesus' body and to bury it? Commonly, people say, based on the limited descriptions that we have, it seems like people crucified for crimes, identified as criminals, are kind of thrown into a mass grave, are not given that full burial process that you might want to give. And so then something like this, where, well, it's in the ossuary, it's in the family tomb, it's in this Jewish grave complex, that proves that you can do this. Well, is one proof of a process, or is one maybe an exemption or a special instance? The ossuary is something that gets connected to wealth.
Yeah.
We know that individuals, families are buried together. And so when you're gathered to the bones of your father, you're gathered to your fathers, as the Hebrew Bible puts it, yeah, you're going to be in a family tomb. And then the body does its thing, and then the bones are collected. And if you can afford an ossuary, it might go into this, and the bones of multiple individuals are put into one ossuary. Or there are pits that are in the family graves, and the bones are stacked together in that pit. That is the less expensive way to do this. So something like the ossuary itself and the place where it is buried seems to indicate that this individual's family had some wealth, had some status. So could they potentially pull some strings to get the body to bury it? Does this mean everyone was allowed to do this? Do they get an exemption? Is the body buried right away? Do they take the body out of a different place and inter it? All of these are things that a heel bone with a nail through it can't answer for us.
Yeah. It can tell us that there was the potential of crucifixion in the province of Judea.
Yeah.
And that potentially they could be buried, but you have to keep in mind all of the things you just said.
There's a lot of well, yes, that they end up there. How do they get there? When do they get there? Was this an exemption? Is this because they paid somebody off? Are they given all of the what ifs that might happen, which if you're reading a scholarly discussion on, okay, what is this heel bone and what can it tell us, are the parts where they are respectfully and properly hedging around the arguments that can be made. It's a heel bone. It has a nail through it. Okay. The nail has some fragments of wood left on it. Okay, so things that might lead to the identification with crucifixion. But then where do you go from there with it? You can offer possibilities, but definitives are kind of outside the realm of possibility in that case, because it can't tell us those things. You can't hold it up. What is it going to say to you? Put it to your ear. It doesn't tell you anything. They're interpretations off of this and the small descriptions that we have of crucifixion. And then largely they get used, this heel bone gets used to say, well, what do I want this to tell me about the gospel's description of the crucifixion and burial of Jesus? And that's where it goes most often, ignoring the fact that it doesn't really have anything to connect to that other than this individual was crucified.
Yeah.
I think something else with this that is a debate point to note as well. in the way that it gets used to discuss the practice of crucifixion that I think shows, well, how can this say something for scholars? Is this has led to ongoing debates of were individuals crucified with the nail through the feet, through the heels, both heels together, heels separate. That's where they're looking at something like this and the other bones to say, what can this tell us? Those are the kinds of things that bones can tell us about. How long is the nail? Is it long enough to go through 2 heels or just through 1? Does the other heel bone show evidence of having been punctured in the same way or not? That's where something like this has stuff that it can say.
Yeah.
It is a find that it was discovered, it was excavated properly, it has the backstory behind it in the excavation. It's not something that came up on the black market to say, and here's the proof, and that's not how this came about. And so it leads to debates, and I think sometimes people see it connected to debates and think, well, the debates are then about it's not about it being connected to Jesus. It's debates about the practice of Roman crucifixion, which people think is like well understood, when in reality, it's not that well understood.
It's well known.
It's famous.
But understood,
not so
a
much.
Different avenue.
I mean, I a lot of this stuff too, like, is anything really well understood in archaeology? It is until we find something new that changes that. And so something can feel like it's well understood or be well established, but one find can suddenly overturn a lot of what we thought we knew about some sort of practice. And so in the gap that is descriptions of crucifixion, archaeological evidence connected to crucifixion, small finds can become really important for archaeologists and their real claims, and then also unfortunately become really important for claims that want to overuse in a space where there is not much that can be held on to. This small list of things are the same things that show up in list after list after list as proof of X, Y, or Z when they aren't that. It doesn't mean they have nothing to say. It doesn't mean that they're not important. They are for other things.
Yeah, they're just not proving what a lot of people, I think, want to prove.
It doesn't prove that Jesus was crucified. They can't.
No.
It doesn't prove that Jesus was resurrected. It can't. That is not the thing that any of these can do.
It can't do that at all.
Yeah, what is the piece of evidence that would be that? That's not what these things can do. That is the over-application of archaeology, which is something that happens all the time because it's a term that people respect largely. Some people hold archaeology with a lot of skepticism because it gets overused by people in context to say, well, archaeologists have, or this artifact does. And it just gets leveraged on people to say, well, this thing exists, and therefore, and they go off on a path that that object can't support. But if your interaction with archaeology is largely based on things like Indiana Jones, or the movie version of archaeology, which is you go out, you dig real quick, you find a thing, and look.
And it's a treasure chest filled with all the world's secrets.
And we know exactly what they all say, and you can read every language, and and that's not how this works. Instead, you find a small thing like the ossuary, which is not a small find, but it's the ossuary, and then the bones inside, and a heel bone with a nail. And then what arguments can you make from that? Well, theories around how crucifixion works. Not, this proves that Jesus could have been interred. It can't prove that. It might say, we have one example.
Yeah.
Is it possible that this happened? It's possible. It was possible before you had this, that could have happened. So they can't go down that path. So the Yehohanan heel bone, the Pilate Stone, the Alexamenos Graffiti, as archaeological objects, cannot prove those things. But individually,
they can support a context.
They can support their own contexts, their own historical information. Individuals like Pilate or like Alexamenos or like Yehohanan, who had a context of their own and a story of their own, they can say some things to that. Let them say that.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good information.
Yeah.
Don't overlook that. They don't need to be thrown away. We're not doing this list to say you should disregard these things. The exact opposite.
No, take what they actually can tell us and don't turn it into what you want them to tell us.
Let them give the information that they can.
Yeah.
Respect the artifacts, respect the people behind the artifacts to let them represent what they can about themselves in that context rather than just plowing ahead.
And I think that's such an important part is respect the individuals behind the artifacts.
Yeah.
I think that's something a lot of people lose sight of.
When you see them in a museum, they are so stripped of the human story behind the thing. No piece of pottery exists without someone having made it and used it. When you just see it behind glass in a display with a little tag, though, that story is very easy to forget or to not think about. But it matters.
It matters so much more than applying it to your belief system.
So that's our purpose of going through this list, to say these things have a story. Let's respect that version of the story. So that's our short list of 3 frequently pointed to artifacts that are not connected to Jesus and Jesus's crucifixion in the way that people might want them to be, but each have their own materials behind them. So that's kind of the artifact side of the conversation. So that we can then turn to
Josephus.
One of our best friends, Josephus. Josephus, a friend of the channel, problematic friend of the channel.
Problematic.
And the claims, because this is then the sidebar that you'll normally get the lists that are, well, here's the archaeology, and then here's the textual outside of the Bible. When they want to say outside the gospel records, what do we have that speaks to this? Josephus is almost always on those lists.
And this is something you and I have talked about a few times. We did a Patreon episode.
Yeah, we have a whole Patreon bonus
episode on this. And then we did a lot of it in Second Temple.
This has been a thing in class. We have a full conversation just talking about this on Patreon. If you're interested in just this conversation, I'd say go sign up for Patreon as a part of that bonus content. But I think let's just get to exactly what do people say Josephus has to say about Jesus.
So first off, where is this coming from?
This is coming from Antiquities.
Yes, Book 18.
Book 18, and we also have a reference in Book 20 as well. Mm-hmm. So there's 2 of these references in Josephus that mention Jesus. Jesus. There's multiple Jesuses that get mentioned in Josephus, not all of them being the Jesus people want to be mentioned in Josephus. Book 18 is the one that gets the most attention. Book 20, it's a much shorter reference. And so in Book 18, we have a context of events in Pilate's service or
Pilate's
reign.
Back.
Pilate's back. Pilate gets talked about in Josephus.
Yeah.
And so Josephus is going through and saying, here are some of the things that Pilate is doing and how he's making everyone furious.
Mm-hmm.
Because Pilate, according to Josephus, simply does not care.
Yeah.
Pilate is there to make people angry and look at me, impose my power. I'm going to impose the will of the Romans on you, and I don't care how this goes. And sometimes doing things like building an aqueduct where Pilate says, we'll be happy. I brought you water. How did I pay for it? Yeah, stuff from the temple, but don't worry about that part. And so in this narrative, Josephus is going through and saying, here are things in 1855 through 62 that Pilate is doing, like bringing in Caesar's effigies, like building these aqueducts. And people are not happy about this. And then we get this little line in 63 and 64 that becomes the part that people talk about, which is this Jesus reference in Josephus. If you go and look at your text of Josephus, English or Greek, it is in there.
Mm-hmm.
The debate is how it got there. And then after this, we turn to a whole different story about the temple of Isis in Rome. And so this moment is like this odd transition break between narrative about Pilate, Jesus reference, wild story about the temple of Isis in Rome.
Well, this is such an interesting passage because just so much about it. It's the context of the text and it's the material of it itself. Josephus, as a Jewish Roman author, explicitly calling Jesus the Christ.
Yes. If we accept the text.
If we accept the text.
As it is. And so this is the point of the debates that happen here. This exists, this reference exists in the copies of Josephus that we have.
Mm-hmm.
That's something you will see when people go, well, why would you have any questions? It's in my copy. It's in the Greek copy. It's in the oldest Greek copies that we have. Case closed. It is there. Well, okay, do the next step, which is how old are the oldest Greek copies that we have? And then you find out, okay, it's the 10th or the 11th centuries when some people are dated a little bit earlier to the 10th century. That's when the oldest Greek copies that we have. So is that Josephus's version, or is there a long span of time when texts can be changed? There's a window in there. Also important in that is Josephus becomes a very important text for Christians, for the early church. Josephus is a text that everyone seems to have had. And so if you have this individual that becomes an important author and text for you, that if it doesn't have a reference to Jesus, which we might have evidence that it didn't, according to Origen, who we talked about earlier, when he says some things about Josephus not accepting Christ or doesn't reference Christ, and is this he doesn't accept as in doesn't believe in, some people want to say, or doesn't accept as in does not mention, not totally sure, but Josephus, maybe there's a window. Josephus may not have mentioned. By the 10th century, Josephus does mention. As this
he had
Jewish...
a long life.
And he's not alive in the 10th century anymore.
Kidding.
That's a good point to clarify. Josephus is not writing in the 10th century. Josephus is writing...
First century?
Yeah, which is why people want to say this could be that early external reference, because Josephus is placed largely like 37 to 100 CE, with antiquities coming near the end of his life. And so if this exists, this is an early external reference to Jesus, which if Josephus is calling Jesus the Christ as a Jewish Roman historian, then that's a lot. So let's read 1863 and 64. So if you haven't heard this before, you know what we're talking about in Josephus. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had him condemned to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. It's a lot.
It's a lot, which is such a point for me, because Josephus is very valuable in a lot of different ways, but he's a rambler.
He's a rambler.
He's
a rambler.
He wants to tell you this happened, this happened there, and he's going to give you a lot of little details.
He loves a little detail.
He loves a little detail. This is like in here. Like
it's nice and succinct.
It's compact.
It almost sounds creedal.
It's creedal. And it's not Josephus-like. In comparison to the amount of work we have from Josephus, this isn't Josephus-like. And I said earlier, but the context of who Josephus is, I feel like really matters in this.
Yeah.
And I'm very
skeptical.
I'm very skeptical of this, obviously, but it's creedal.
The language of it is something that people debate, where this is where getting into the weeds of what verbs does Josephus use and how are his sentences structured? That's where scholars will make their arguments on this sounds like it came from Josephus, or this sounds like it came in later, trying to be like Josephus, but because you're trying to be like, you are not. And so it's not perfect. Some people say this sounds like the person responsible for this insertion. We stand with the scholars who say that this looks like it's an insertion by a later hand who is interested in making sure there's a reference to Jesus in Josephus. And so after the reference to Pilate, much like people who look at the Pilate Stone and say, okay, this proves Jesus, maybe someone saw this description of some of Pilate's activities and says this would be a perfect moment to throw in a phrase about Pilate doing what? Being responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus.
Well, with the respect and authority that Josephus gets, both in the ancient world and now as a historian, why wouldn't he talk about Jesus?
Why wouldn't he talk about Jesus? Maybe because he has no interest in talking about Jesus.
Maybe because he doesn't believe in Jesus.
Jesus.
He's on the Roman payroll.
He's on the payroll as an official historian within the house of the emperor. The Christians are not at this point a large community. There's lots of reasons why he might not discuss this. He does talk about John the Baptist. which is something people also sometimes have some discomfort with of you're talking about John the Baptist, but you're not then going to talk about Jesus. And so maybe he talks about both. Or this passage has some things about it that seem un-Josephus-like to many scholars, also feel to really drive the point home of the core points that you would want Josephus to talk about in a quick moment, that Jesus is the Christ, that Pilate condemns him to die on the cross, that he's alive after the third day, that this was prophesied, and that the Christians are not extinct to this day.
If it be lawful to call him a man.
Hits all the bases.
Also, with the recent discussion on Christology,
Mm-hmm.
that's a high Christology.
Yeah, if it be lawful to call him a man. He's not saying that he's not human, because it does say condemned to the cross and then appeared alive on the third day. So yeah, what point, how is Josephus, or the hand that's pretending to be Josephus, balancing the divine and the human here? Where do we sit on those things? There's parts of this that just don't line up with the way Josephus talks. And I think the narrative flow of this, if you're reading from the stuff on Pilate and the rebellions, and you could say, well, Jesus is condemned as a part of this rebellious. That's probably why it sits in here, yes. And then the hard transition to the Temple of Isis in Rome, right? Narrative-wise, it doesn't totally make sense. It doesn't fully add up. The claims that it's in the oldest versions we have, well, those are from the 10th century, so that's not like a nail in the coffin argument. The arguments that Josephus mentions many other biblically relevant occurrences.
But that's what Josephus is
That's
doing.
what Josephus does for the Hebrew Bible.
He's writing a Jewish history.
Yeah. So like that claim ignores when they say biblically relevant occurrences. Yeah. Which ones is Josephus focused on talking about? The materials from the Hebrew Bible. Josephus is not concerned with the materials that will become the New Testament, because Josephus does not have the materials that will become the New Testament. And even if he did, if he was to be later and have those things, is that something he would be concerned with telling us about or not? So those are the types of things that you should know when you're looking at this, that are debates. And then the arguments come from scholars then of, okay, when might this have come in, and who might have put it in, and when, and who knew who, because it's in the Greek versions, and then a different version is in this form that we have in Arabic. And then, okay, we have some things in Eusebius who may or may not know a version. That's the transmission history, which is where scholars love to spend their time and say, how might things have gone if it was inserted and when? But they don't all agree, because we don't have manuscript to manuscript to manuscript where you can see that clear path developing along. So is Josephus talking about Jesus in the received version that we have? Yes. Should we have some questions about that version? Yeah, you should have some questions about the version of Jesus that we see in Josephus in Antiquities, Book 18. The version that we get in Antiquities, Book 20, I think also, it's much shorter. It's one that gets less attention because it doesn't have the full creedal weight kind of thing behind it.
Well, the one in 20 is a little different.
The one in 20 is shorter because we get the return to the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, and whose name was James. And so that's the line that gets people's attention, is the return of the who was called Christ part. Some people look at the 20 and say, well, this feels like a kind of aside that Josephus might naturally make here. The Christ part, maybe not. But is this reference to Jesus original and the Christ part was inserted? That's one argument that people make. A different argument is that this isn't talking about that Jesus, but if you read through this section in 2197 through 203, it's talking about the priesthood being handed between individuals and who is dying and who is taking it. And it ends with saying, and made Jesus, the son of Damnaeus, high priest. So is this the Jesus that was being talked about earlier, the brother of Jesus? Is it that Jesus, the same one that becomes the priest? Because that's not the Jesus that is going to be the one that gets called the Christ by the early church, or those two different Jesuses. It's another one where people debate, but it doesn't have much getting pushed into it.
It's like a click, like, oh, the Christ. By the way, in case you didn't know.
And the reason why some argue that it can be briefer, because 18 exists.
Yes.
So because the reference in 18 was already there that establishes this fuller context, this is just a callback to say, remember what I told you before. Whether 18 is there or not, then can change that. Because if 18 comes in later, then this one, who is this? If they're both getting put in later, so those are places where people have debates on, is this there? When might this have been there? Is Josephus likely, as you said, to be wanting to make these kind of arguments? Probably not.
I mean, I think it's important for people to remember that everything he writes has to go through the Romans.
Yeah. He has to keep the Flavian dynasty happy with his history. And sometimes it seems like you're reading it and you might think, Josephus, you might be towing the line when you're telling this story on some of these things. But as a historian who is on the payroll of the Flavians, is this a version of things that you might want to have within this? Is this material that will get through as you're telling that story or not? Or are you just expecting, maybe somebody makes the argument, well, Josephus doesn't expect them to actually read it. And so it's going to come out and then you'd be, well, that's something that's a speculative argument. But there's reasons to doubt that the material in 18 is there, that has this always been there? Did this come in later? There's things that lead scholars to say that this might be something that came in later. 20, kind of in the same category. In both cases, even if it is original, if you want to accept that both the passage in 18 and the passage in 20 come from Josephus's hand, does that prove? No. It, again, like we have with the other things, it tells you that there is, in this context, individuals who, what do they believe about Jesus? Even if you say Josephus wrote it, then he's telling you these Christians that he says are still around to this day, here's what they think about this individual and what they have. It's a declaration of, at most, the beliefs of those individuals.
Not the whole sequence of events externally being corroborated.
It can't do that.
No.
Just like the Alexamenos graffiti, if it is the earliest depiction of Jesus being crucified, if you accept those connections, does it prove that? No. Does Josephus' description of this prove? No, they are telling you about the claims, the arguments, the beliefs of the individuals that they are talking about, whether they are mocking them in the Alexamenos graffiti, whether it's Josephus retelling or a later hand pretending to be Josephus, putting this in. Those are the limits that need to be placed around these kinds of things. All of them open up good doors for conversations and questions.
And context.
But proof they are not.
Proof they are not.
I think that's a happy place for us to leave. And you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, you didn't talk about the most famous one.
The Shroud of
The
Turin.
Shroud. I would say we have talked about this one. We have a full podcast on this. We've talked about this in some lives as well. We have a response to Mel Gibson's conversations about this. We still stand by the positions that we argued there. So we have seen the influx of comments, let's say, leading into Easter, talking about you need to come up to date. We have read the up-to-date stuff, and we still say that doesn't prove the things that you want this to prove. So Shroud is not coming into this one. We're going to say leave that aside. Go and watch those other things if you want to see that. Bob and I talk through the Shroud in those. Proof of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. Go look at those for the conversations that happen there. But that's where we're going to leave this one at today. If you have a question about one of these objects or another that we didn't get to that you think maybe should be a point for conversation, if it comes from, a legitimate archaeological excavation and has a context and these things, put it down in the comments.
Yeah.
This will come out before Easter. We can return to some things. There's always time to talk about more within this. So if there's a thing we didn't get to, a question that we didn't address within one of these, let us know. We're happy to hear from you. We have the comment section down below. If you're listening to us on Apple or on Spotify, you can leave a comment there. You can send us an email. You can come join us on Patreon and send us questions there. If you join us on Patreon, you can get access to bonus content like that Josephus episode that we did, as well as bonus episodes every week where we're working through the text of the Hebrew Bible a couple chapters at a time. It's like a Hebrew Bible for everyone class without the homework. What more could you ask for? I think it's a pretty good deal. But right now, we'll leave this here. Mary Kate, thanks for taking the time.
Well, thank you as always.
Always happy to talk through things. Thank you everyone for listening. Like, subscribe, follow on whatever platform you are. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you keep up with us as things come out. But for Mary Kate, I'm Jordan. For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, until next time.